Welcome to the 1950s, a decade when the hydrogen bomb was scary, communists were scarier, and stock footage and ominous narration about the dangers of scientific advancement was a great form of American entertainment. I'm Steve Ryfle, and this is Godzilla Raids Again, the very first of many Godzilla sequels, and one of the most unusual Godzilla movies of all. And as you may know, this is a film that was originally released in the United States with the title Gigantis, the Fire Monster. Why is this movie unusual? Well, for starters, this prologue is not only a great example of the paranoid hyperbole that accompanied many 1950s science fiction movies, it's also the first of many sections in this movie where the American distributors felt the need to insert stock footage from the U.S. military, the space program, World War II newsreels, and even from other movies. If you flip this disc over and watch the Japanese version, you'll notice that the changes made to this version, both in quantity and quality, are staggering. Narration that never stops, describing everything, even as you see it happening on screen. A soundtrack comprised of mismatched stock library music that never stops playing. Bizarre dialogue, characters and monsters that keep changing names. It's all very entertaining. To borrow a line from our narrator here, the changes this movie underwent in America were not built by an accumulation of the best minds in the world. There have been long-standing rumors that Godzilla was renamed Gigantis in this film because Warner Brothers, the American distributor, couldn't obtain the rights to Godzilla's name from Joseph E. Levine, who distributed the first Godzilla film in America. Well, that doesn't make any sense because Levine only had distribution rights. He certainly didn't have the rights to Godzilla's name. Paul Schreibman, the American producer, proudly admitted in a 1995 interview that it was his decision to change Godzilla's name to Gigantis. He said, quote, "We called it Gigantis because we didn't want it to be confused with Godzilla." But it is Godzilla, Paul. Personally, I just think that Paul Schreibman was fond of renaming things. Just look at these opening credits. Minoru Chiaki becomes Mindru Chiaki. Writer Shigeru Kayama becomes Shigem Kayama. Special effects master Eiji Tsuburaya is Eliji Tsuburaya. And the film's director, Motoyoshi Oda, is renamed Motoyoshi QDQ. By the way, Paul Schreibman's name appears twice in the credits, spelled correctly both times. In the 1950s, there was a great deal of popular interest in Japanese culture in America. If you thumb through old copies of Time and Life magazines, you might find articles about Japanese flower arranging and tea ceremonies, and I suspect that this stock footage was very much indicative of how Americans unfortunately perceived Japan back then, as a mysterious and somewhat backward nation of rice farmers and fishermen. This airplane flying is the first piece of footage that comes from the Japanese version. Everything we've seen up until now has been stock footage. Even the opening credits used footage from the city destruction sequence that comes later in the movie. Tsukioka here is played by Hiroshi Koizumi, a very recognizable actor to anyone who's a big fan of Toho science fiction movies. And performing Tsukioka's dialogue in this version is Chinese-American actor Ki Luke, who became famous as Lee Chan, Charlie Chan's number one son in the 1930s, among many other roles. The story bears strong similarities to the first Godzilla movie, which is no coincidence. The original treatment was again written by sci-fi novelist Shigeru Kayama, and the screenplay was again co-written by Takeo Murata, who this time shares writing duties with Shigeaki Hidaka. And once again, the story is about the appearance of Godzilla in Japan and how that appearance disrupts the lives of three young people who are intertwined by friendship and love. And yet again, in this movie, one of these three characters will sacrifice himself to save the world from the monster. It's not a full-blown love triangle as in the first Godzilla movie, and the story doesn't carry the same sense of tragedy and sorrow. The fact that Ishiro Honda felt so strongly that nuclear weapons could be man's undoing, that's what made the first Godzilla movie what it is. And I think if Honda hadn't directed that film, it might have turned out something more like this one, a rather standard giant monster movie. And this is Tsukioka's sweetheart, Hidemi, played by the lovely actress Setsuko Wakayama, who at the time was married to one of Toho's great directors, Senkichi Taniguchi. They later divorced. Kiss me again, I'm all yours. Hidemi's friend here, the Morse code girl, is played by Mayuri Mokusho, and she delivers some of the best lines in the movie, even if they are a bit nonsensical in the American version. This is a movie where the sidekicks, the second banana characters, have a bit more personality than the leading man and woman, who are rather low-key throughout. And now here's the third character in what we'll call our friendship triangle, Kobayashi, played by the great actor Minoru Chiaki. Tsukioka is a fish scouting pilot for a local cannery, and he's in love with the boss's daughter. And as we'll soon find out, he's also a man full of doubts about his own intestinal fortitude. Does he have courage? I'm not sure why he's so self-loathing. Anybody who flies one of these little planes over the ocean for a living is a braver man than I. You may have noticed that the music soundtrack is almost non-stop and that the style of the music changes constantly. There's no clear theme to the soundtrack, and it sounds like it came from different movies, and that's because it did. The Deer Slayer, Kronos, and It, The Terror from Beyond Space, all three of which were relatively new movies at the time, released in 1957 and 8. The next time the FAA investigates an air disaster, wouldn't it be interesting if the official explanation was that the plane conked out? The dialogue in this film is not only nonsensical at times, it often uses these awkward or arcane expressions, as we'll discuss as we go along.
Then, as I flew through the haze, I looked anxiously below, searching. There was no sign of him, and suddenly there it was.
Well, as Tsukioka continues to give us the tour guide version of this movie, let's talk a little bit about how this production came about. Godzilla, of course, was a great success in Japan, selling 9 million plus movie tickets. And as the story goes, Iwao Mori, who was Toho's chief of production, was overseas when Godzilla came out in November of 1954, and he returned a few weeks later to Tokyo and he saw what a great success the film had been. He was, of course, very pleased, so he told Tomoyuki Tanaka, the producer of the first Godzilla movie, to go ahead and make another one. Now, this movie came out about 6 months later after that conversation took place, so the term quickie sequel really does come to mind. There are a great many special effects scenes in this film, many of which are nicely done, which is quite amazing considering the time constraints. But the most noticeable differences between this movie and the previous one are in the writing and the directing. Godzilla Raids Again is really more about the characters and their personal lives rather than what's happening to them and how they react to it and what it all means. Normally, I would never criticize a movie for being too focused on the characters, but these people aren't well drawn enough to really hold our interest. The music in this sequence really tries very hard to tweak the audience's emotions with a variety of generic-sounding stock orchestral themes, one right after the other. And you may have noticed in the opening credits that no composer was mentioned, only the music editor, Rex Lipton. And that's really a dead giveaway that stock music was used. These compositions are by composers Bert Schefter and Paul Sautel, a prolific musical duo that wrote music for many films in the 50s and 60s, including the three titles that we mentioned earlier. And it seems the idea of all this new music was to quicken the pace, or at least to create the illusion of quickening the pace.
When you get to town, you might go to a store and get the girls a present.
Down, boy. These two men must be very good friends if Tsukioka allows Kobayashi to talk to him like a terrier. Trying to please a woman is like swimming the ocean. There's a double entendre. But this male bonding session round the campfire comes to an abrupt ending. Look at the bottom of the screen here. It goes by really quickly, but there's some nice optical composition work to put the two actors into the same frame as the monsters and create the illusion of the creature's size. We've got to get out. That's an understatement. In the Japanese version, these two characters recognize one of the monsters as Godzilla, but in this version, when Tsukioka asks his buddy, "What are those things?" Kobayashi replies, "I don't know." As the heroes take cover in the canyon, it's a reminder of how much bigger a production the first movie was. The monster first appeared on an island in that film too, but those scenes were shot on location and they just felt more real because of it. And when you consider the tight production schedule, it's remarkable how impressive much of the special effects work in this film is, and yet it's kind of ironic how visually unimpressive much of the live-action work is. We're only 9 minutes into the movie and already we get a great look at the monsters. Usually we have to wait a lot longer. This time there's a second monster, Anguirus, also called Anguilas in other Toho films, and one of Godzilla's most popular co-stars. For this shot of the monsters tumbling into the sea, the two stunt actors were inside the costumes. If they hadn't been inside, the suits would have just floated to the top of the water. And in a scene like this, several handlers would jump into the water just after the director yelled cut and pulled the stunt actors to the surface because the suits were very heavy and the actors could have easily drowned.
Creating a spout of
And as we watch this spout of bubbling foam, our narrator tells us that we're watching a spout of bubbling foam. He's very observant. Well, whether it was by design or by happenstance, the Raymond Burr version of the first Godzilla movie is fairly respectful to the original material that it was made from. By comparison, Godzilla Raids Again was altered far less for the US market, and yet as you watch this version of the movie, it feels drastically different from the original because the alterations that were made are so strange and really unnecessary a lot of the time. And nowhere is this more obvious than in this scene where our heroes tell the authorities about the monsters. The white-haired scientist, Dr. Tadokoro, who's played by Masao Shimizu, utters one of the movie's many dialogue gems here. Upon hearing the boy's story, yes, he calls these two grown men boys, he says, "This is bad," and to drive his point home, he repeats, "This is bad." I agree. The dialogue throughout the movie is not a direct translation of the Japanese dialogue, but a rather loose interpretation of it. In this scene, it's extremely loose. In the Japanese version, the characters are talking about the reappearance of Godzilla and the new second monster and the dire implications of all that. But here the characters are rather confusingly trying to figure out what both monsters are and what their proper names are, and they're reading a bestseller titled Ankylosaurus, Killer of the Living. It's really interesting how the monster nomenclature changes during this scene, and indeed throughout this whole movie. We have the Anguirus family of fire monsters, then we have the Gigantis monster of the Anguirus family, and later we'll have the Gigantis object. And at one point, Dr. Yamane refers mistakenly to Gigantis as Anguirus. And of course, Anguirus and Gigantis are really Angulus and Godzilla, so it's all very, very confusing. The pseudoscience in this scene is absolutely hilarious. A science textbook that postulates that H-bomb tests could revive the dinosaurs, which would then wipe out the human race. I've got to get me a copy of that book. Incidentally, the book they're reading is actually the Dinosaur book by Edwin Colbert, which was published in the 1940s and was one of the first comprehensive books on dinosaurs. The English dubbing was supervised by Hugo Grimaldi, whose illustrious list of credits also includes one of the Bruce Lee pictures from Hong Kong from the 70s. We don't know who wrote the English script, and in fact only the Japanese screenwriters were mentioned in the credits, which is ludicrous. They certainly didn't write this material. This is Takashi Shimura, one of Japan's greatest film actors. And in the Japanese version, it's clear that Dr. Yamane is shocked by the return of Godzilla because he saw the monster die in the last movie. And of course, Dr. Yamane predicted that continued nuclear testing could bring another Godzilla, and that's precisely what's happened. His prediction has come true. But by pretending that this is not a Godzilla movie, the American producers really undermined this scene, because instead of a great scientist facing the fact that a horrible nightmare might be relived again, Dr. Yamane just looks kind of bored. At the dawn of time, there were ferocious monsters that resembled children's toys, and the surface of the earth was covered with swamps made of dry ice. This is the formation of the world as science has been able to reconstruct it. Or a third-grade science project. The first time I ever saw this movie and this primordial soup and dinosaur sequence began to play, I wondered if Toho might have lost its mind in the mid-50s. But of course, none of this footage is actually from Toho. And unfortunately, we really don't know where a lot of this stuff might have originated from. Judging from the level of quality, I'd say it's possible that the original source might have been educational films for children. I hate to tell you what that looks like to me. Wherever this footage comes from, it should have stayed there. Well, now we learn that there were solar disturbances and the prehistoric monsters went underground. And climate changes caused volcanoes to erupt. Perhaps the cavemen should have given up driving those Hummers. Well, basically, we spliced together all the Grade Z prehistoric movie stock footage we could find, and voila, here is our version of unintelligent design theory. Now we see four very special effects shots in a row. Some jittery stop motion, a Dimetrodon prop, some lizards with fins glued on their backs, and some guys in rubber T-Rex costumes. The dinosaurs, the men in the T-Rex suits, that footage is from the 1949 film Unknown Island. Well, now we're finally back to our real movie, already in progress. In the Japanese version, there's no extended Discovery Channel-style prologue with pipe cleaner dinosaurs, and Dr. Yamane's film starts here. There's also no music or narration, just the sound of the film projector, and it's rather somber. Everybody's really depressed at the sight of this. You notice this movie literally almost never shuts up. It's a strange alteration because the original version had so many long moments of quiet, which underscored the gravity of the situation. I told you earlier that Paul Schreibman, the American producer, had a penchant for renaming things, and I was only half joking. Before this movie was released in America in 1959, there was a short announcement in Daily Variety, and Schreibman said at that time that the original Japanese title of the film was Anguirus. This was undoubtedly part of Schreibman's ingenious scheme to hide the fact that this was really the second Godzilla movie. But this begs the question, how could the American producers possibly think they could fool the public into believing this was not a Godzilla movie? We're watching a full 3 minutes of footage from Godzilla's attack on Tokyo in the last film. Any monster movie fan in the audience back in 1959 would have recognized this, and in fact many people did. It's rather astonishing, though, that none of the major newspapers that reviewed this movie were able to make the connection. In the Japanese version, Dr. Yamane makes it pretty clear that this is a second Godzilla in this movie, and so we can assume that since Godzilla never died again in the original cycle of films, it's this Godzilla that carried on the series for years to come. Well, we learn now that the oxygen destroyer destroyed the oxygen, which explains why it was called the oxygen destroyer, I guess. In the mid-1950s, Toho was still experimenting with the science fiction genre, and you can really feel the growing pains in this movie. As we said, the story here is basically a retread of the first Godzilla, but there's really no suspense anymore because we already know what Godzilla is and what it's capable of. And the characters aren't faced with the same kind of ethical choices that gave the other film its weight, such as whether or not to use the oxygen destroyer. So the formula for the first Godzilla, which was basically patterned after American giant monster movies of the time period, had already basically played out. And it wasn't until the late 1950s and especially the 1960s that Toho would invent its own brand of science fiction. But here, the genre was still in its infancy. The dialogue for this scene was completely rewritten for the English version so that Tsukioka openly expresses doubts about his own courage. And this scripting change actually has a bit of a payoff in the story's end when Tsukioka musters his courage to take part in the big battle against Godzilla. In the Japanese version, he has even less of a personality than he does here. As the historian Ian Baruma has observed, in Japan, especially for men, quote, feelings are to be felt, not spoken. And in fact, in the Japanese version, these two characters in this scene are talking about something completely different. Here, Tsukioka has one of the most memorable lines in all of movie history, banana oil. This was actually a bit of flapper-era slang that essentially means BS, and it's another case of the dubbers trying hard to find a word that matches the lip movements of the original Japanese dialogue, which in this case was bakara, which means dummy. Tsukioka is essentially calling his girlfriend a dummy. How nice. George Takei, who worked on this film, says that when this scene was recorded, everybody laughed when the banana oil line came up because this was a really outdated expression even in the 50s.
As soon as you see anything. No report on sightings up to now. All units on the alert. We are waiting your general alarm and will...
Even though the first Godzilla was a great success, it took a while before Ishiro Honda became closely identified with monster movies, and in fact his first film after Godzilla was a love story. Behind the camera for this film was Motoyoshi Oda, a veteran Toho director, and I asked film historian Stuart Galbraith IV to give us a little bit of background on Oda.
Well, Oda's style was, to get it done by Tuesday. He was one of Toho's most prolific directors, but his output was really limited almost exclusively to B pictures. During the 1950s, he averaged about 5 movies a year. That Oda was chosen to direct Godzilla Raids Again pretty much confirms that from the beginning, Toho looked upon the film as basically a high-end B movie. The studio would plug Oda into whatever jobs were around, regardless of genre, so that he bounced around between comedies and mysteries and every other kind of B picture. Let me tell you a bit about Oda, or as he's billed in the American credits, Motoyoshi Kuru. Born in 1910, he was a contemporary of Honda and Akira Kurosawa and Senkichi Taniguchi, and all of them studied under director Kajiro Yamamoto in the 1930s. Probably his most prestigious film came in 1947 when he directed The Lady from Hell, which was co-written by Kurosawa It's worth noting that although he had been directing movies since 1940, Oda was still considered such a minor talent that as late as 1953, he worked as a kind of chief assistant director and production coordinator, billed in the credits as special effects staff supervisor on Honda's war movie Eagle of the Pacific. And that, plus his immediate assignment before this, The Invisible Avenger, probably were the reasons he landed this effects-heavy assignment. No one really seems to know what happened to him or his career. He made his last movie in 1958, and he was only 48 years old at the time, but didn't make any more movies and died in 1973. Who knows, maybe he moved to Hokkaido and became a fisherman.
The stock footage montages which reoccur throughout this movie are quite amusing. The submarines and warships are taken from old war newsreels, and they're the kind of stuff you'd see in a variety of low-budget movies in those days. But just as we saw farmers and fishermen in the beginning of the movie, now we get more stereotypical images of Japan, such as a Shinto shrine. And one of these images appears to be military officers praying, and it's quite possible these are Japanese soldiers during the war praying for victory in battle. The effect of all this stock footage is to make the movie feel much cheaper than it actually was. The stock footage is so grainy and mismatched and so inferior to the Toho footage that it's sandwiched between. Well, as we said earlier, there's a lack of urgency in this movie, and you can really notice it in a scene like this one, where all the characters hear the news that the monsters are not expected to visit Osaka, and so they breathe a sigh of relief. This is a rather blatant and obvious way to foreshadow the events to come. Nobody watching this movie back in the day could have possibly been fooled by this ruse. The American producers spared no expense. Rumor has it that they hired the same spinning headline specialists who worked on Citizen Kane. These neon lights in the city of Osaka are not stock footage, but actually from Godzilla Raids Again. And notice how modern Japan actually looks compared to the images we saw at the beginning of the movie. I thought this was a little nation of people. In these scenes with the dancers twirling their fans, you can see that swastikas were rather sloppily censored out of the picture on each side of the stage. But they're not Nazi swastikas, they're left-facing Buddhist swastikas, a Japanese religious symbol. So whoever matted these symbols out of the picture was either ignorant or just overly cautious. Then there's 1,000 geishas playing shamisen and a series of nightclub shots where the musicians and all the patrons are Caucasian, and it's clearly not Japan. Many of the early Toho science fiction pictures had a musical scene or sequence, and often it would take place in a nightclub, such as here. In the years after the war, Japanese pop music was increasingly influenced by Western music, and this beautiful waltz, which is performed by Miyoko Hoshino, sounds a lot like something that Dinah Shore might have sang in the years after the war, and the arrangement that the band is playing isn't a far cry from Nelson Riddle's early work. Miyoko Hoshino, by the way, sang a song in 1964 on an album by the jazz great Lionel Hampton titled East Meets West. Hiroshi Koizumi, who plays Tsukioka, looks quite handsome here, far more so than he did in other Toho science fiction movies where he usually played a scientist. I interviewed Mr. Koizumi in 1999, and he said something quite interesting. He said that when he watches these movies now, he feels kind of bad because he had relatively easy parts to play, and he feels now that he could have done so much more with them. And it is true that Koizumi tended to play rather bland characters in the science fiction films, which really didn't allow him to flex his acting muscles very much. But I recently saw a mid-50s film by director Mikio Naruse titled Late Chrysanthemums, which is a drama about post-war life in Japan. And in that film, Koizumi plays a young man who takes up with an older, wealthy woman so that he can escape from the slums, and it creates quite a scandal. His performance in that movie is really powerful and a far cry from anything he did in these movies, although he's also very good as the edgy boat captain in Matango. And if you yell monster in a crowded nightclub, don't expect the people not to panic. Look at the drummer in the back of the room running away with his tom-tom. Don't forget the snare. Single file, please. Remember that in the first Godzilla, the monster disrupted the festivities on a party boat, and Toho monsters really have a way of interrupting the nightlife. In Frankenstein Conquers the World, War of the Gargantuas famously, and especially Godzilla vs. Hedorah, where the psychedelic nightclub is buried in the monster's sludge. As these planes fly in formation over Osaka, here's a scene where Tsukioka's endless talking really undercuts the impact of the visuals. When you watch the Japanese version, pay attention to this scene, and you'll hear nothing but the roar of the planes and the warning sirens, and it's truly chilling, perhaps the best moment in the movie. And I suspect this blackout scene may have been eerily reminiscent of what it was like to live in a major Japanese city near the end of World War II, when the Americans were strafing Japanese cities and burning them to the ground.
One dared guess.
Well, you've heard me talking about all the library music that's used in this version of the movie, but in the sequence where Godzilla comes ashore, we'll hear a few minutes of the actual original music from the Japanese version of the movie, composed by Masaru Sato, one of the greatest Japanese film composers of all time. Stuart, you met and interviewed Mr. Sato. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Masaru Sato really was one of the all-time great film composers of anywhere in the world, really. He expressed to me a great admiration for Henry Mancini, but in truth, I think his style, his innovative nature, and certainly his prolific output was really closer to someone like Ennio Morricone. Sato was this incredibly prolific composer and very proud of that prolificity. More than 300 movies in all, and in 1959 alone wrote 18 scores in 1 year. He was born in 1928 and, fresh out of music school, became a protege to composer Fumio Hayasaka, who wrote all of Kurosawa's best early scores. When Hayasaka died, Sato, who had mainly been scoring films at Nikatsu, took his place and quickly became associated with the same kind of sardonic action films that Morricone would in Italy, though like Morricone, Sato scored films of all kinds. Of his fantasy film scores, Sato was very quick to call Akira Ifukube, quote, the pioneer in that field. My work would have been meaningless if I had not tried to do something very different from him, unquote. I think that's certainly true of Sato's later Godzilla scores, Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, Son of Godzilla, and 1974's Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, all of which are quite wonderful, really, really good scores. His score for Godzilla Raids Again, well, is much more conventional. And when I asked him if it sounded recognizably Satoian, he said, quote, it's like listening to a kid trying to learn. Masaru Sato died in December 1999, shortly before the release of his final film, Ame Agaru.
Here we have a standard issue city evacuation scene in anticipation of the monster's attack. Although when the monsters do arrive, there are a number of special effects shots of people fleeing in the foreground as the monsters are fighting, so obviously there are not many people choosing to obey the evacuation order. This paddy wagon passing by is a foreshadowing of a minor plot diversion that's coming up soon. This scene is shot in day-for-night fashion, giving it an eerie gloom that is quite effective. In fact, the entire movie has a bit of an overcast haze to it, perhaps owing to the fact that it was shot during wintertime. Tsukioka and Hidemi's car is slowed down by all the pedestrians. Note that our main characters don't have to walk, they have a nice car, and as we'll see in a moment, Hidemi lives in a very nice house at the top of a hill overlooking the city, and she's wearing a very nice fur coat. These are people of some stature in the community, not just workaday civilians. If you're looking for themes in this movie, perhaps one of them is that despite the appearance of rebuilding and prosperity 10 years after the war, Japan is still vulnerable to the threat of Godzilla, which of course symbolizes the nuclear threat. These characters are prosperous and successful and optimistic, planning for their bright future together, and yet they're vulnerable. They're about to lose almost everything. The monster finally takes the bait and heads back out to sea where he can be annihilated, and everybody congratulates themselves. Aren't we great?
My main hope was to get her to a safe place.
Here's Hidemi's mansion on the hill, and perhaps here's another bit of symbolic storytelling. The two men have to rush back into the city, into the danger zone, to be with their boss at the fish cannery. They're like two soldiers rushing back to the front line to be with their commander, no matter how powerful the enemy, no matter how bad the odds of victory are. Why do all these men insist on putting themselves in harm's way when they're utterly powerless to stop the monster's attack? Perhaps it's more honorable to die defending your fish cannery, and by extension your country, than to flee into the hills.
Papa, you watch out for him.
But the larger point seems to be that Hidemi, perhaps representing women during the war, is left alone to wonder if the men will ever come back. Not even her fur coat and her nice house and its creature comforts can comfort her in this time. There are several moments in the movie where that war metaphor that was so strong in the first Godzilla film is here again for a fleeting moment. And that's what I like about this movie. In spite of its flaws, it's trying to be a better film than it is. If only moments like this were the rule rather than the exception, and if only Tsukioka would put a sock in it once in a while.
Good news! Good news! General reports to headquarters. Gigantis is going back.
That's good news. The flares are what did the job.
Great.
Now we've come to what I like to call the cops and robbers sequence. It's so different from the rest of the film in almost every way that it feels almost like it was taken out of another movie, and it's all just one big setup to get Godzilla to come back ashore and attack the city. I suppose the samurai haircut was meant to make the stocky convict look mean and tough. The narration in this scene is typically superfluous, as Key Luke tells us that this motley crew is made up of murderers, thieves, and general criminals huddled together. I think we could have figured out on our own that these men are all ne'er-do-wells.
The men understood. They were formulating a plan of their own. They decided to give it.
Here's an early appearance by character actor Senkichi Omura, seated on the left-hand side of the frame.
Hey, you!
Well, that was easy. You can't tell from this scene, but Omura had a flair for comedy, and you may remember him as the interpreter on Faroe Island in King Kong vs. Godzilla.
Ah, what a guy.
It's interesting that no matter how much American popular slang changes, phrases like "what a guy" and "what's up" are still around. The stock music that was added to this sequence almost works. It's an action sequence, and there's a bit of a Keystone Cops feel to it, with the robbers tripping over themselves as they flee, and the action's fast-paced. In fact, it might be slightly sped up via camera trickery.
Hold! Hold or you die! Help him, he's hurt! We got 3 of them. You go after the rest.
Which way they go? Did you see them?
Which way did he go?
Follow me. Come on, let's go. Right.
Motoyoshi Oda's direction of this sequence is actually quite good. The action is exciting and fun, but again, it feels like a totally different movie than the one we've been watching up to this point.
See them? Let's try this street.
Look, there's the cops. Where? There, see him? Quick, there's a truck. Quick, get inside.
Caltex was an American oil company that was later bought out by Chevron. In many of the Toho giant monster films, you'll see company logos and billboards with actual corporate names, sometimes even American companies like this one.
Get in.
In case you've forgotten about our 2 leading men, Tsukioka and Kobayashi just happen along at the right time and give the cops a ride, helping them pursue the runaway convicts in the gasoline tanker.
Lucky this car came along.
This is certainly one of the slowest moving car chases in the history of motion pictures, and it really gives you an idea why the chase scenes in Bullet were considered so groundbreaking a decade or so later. Somehow, as unbelievable as it seems, Tsukioka and Kobayashi actually fall behind the tanker. They might as well get out of the car and chase the convicts on foot. Note the no smoking sign on the wall when the tanker crashes. I'm sure it wasn't meant as a joke, but it seems ironic that the last thing these men saw before they died in a gigantic explosion was a no smoking sign. The miniature set of the oil refinery is quite elaborate and finely detailed, and as it goes up in smoke, igniting a gigantic blaze, Godzilla senses the fire on shore and he loses interest in the puny little flares and wades back towards land. It's amazing how much more sound there is in the US version of this film. We've already talked about the narration and the music, and now we have additional monster roars. The American producers must have felt that Godzilla didn't roar nearly enough because they dubbed in roars throughout this sequence. But they used the wrong roar. That's Anguirus' voice coming out of Godzilla's mouth. But in a way, this change is strangely appropriate since the characters are constantly getting the two monsters' names mixed up. Take a look at the miniature military officers, the little figurines standing behind the cannons operating the weapons. I sure hope these guys are wearing earmuffs or they're going to go deaf. Just like in the first film, some of Godzilla's close-ups are filmed with a hand-operated puppet, and if you look carefully, you'll notice that the puppet isn't an exact match to the suit, particularly in finer details like the teeth. And once again, in some scenes, Godzilla's atomic breath is depicted not with animation, but by having the puppet spray a fine mist of water from its mouth. This is a fantastic moment as Godzilla strikes the fighter plane in midair with his atomic breath. The flaming plane spirals out of control, and as it banks downward, the camera banks with it in perfect synchronization. It's really a daring shot, and one of very few times that Eiji Tsuburaya's crew ever attempted this type of motion in their photography. The only thing that spoils this moment a bit is when the fighter plane hits the surface of the water, and there's a noticeable pause between the impact and the detonation of the explosion that blows up the miniature. Well, we did watch a short monster wrestling match a little while ago on Iwato Island, but when Anguirus comes ashore, this is really Godzilla's first battle with another monster in the midst of a major city. So this film really started a long-running tradition that continued until Godzilla's last movie in 2004. In most of the later films, the big fight came at the end, though, with everything hanging in the balance. This is our big special effects sequence featuring many different techniques and some fine work by special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya and his crew, so I asked Ed Gazucheski, who is an expert on such matters, to join me here.
Glad to be here.
In a way, what we're watching here is Godzilla versus Godzilla because the two actors in the monster suits, Haruo Nakajima and Katsumi Tezuka, both played Godzilla in the first movie.
That's right, and although Nakajima is perhaps the most famous man to ever play Godzilla, Tezuka also spent his share of time in monster suits in the early days of Toho's special effects films. And at this time, Nakajima was in his 20s, and he said that Tezuka, who was already in his 40s, was too old to play a monster. But Tezuka's performance as Anguirus is very physical, and he handles the task admirably. The monster battles in this sequence are very fast-paced and aggressive, and not what you might expect because Godzilla was very slow-moving and very heavy and ponderous in the first movie.
Doctor! General says you ought to leave. That's right. Please, let's go.
Hidemi's father, who is alternately called Papa or Doctor in this version, is played by an obscure actor named Yukio Kasama, who has only one other film credit that we know of. With his glasses and hat, the actor kind of bears a strong physical resemblance to Toho special effects master Eiji Tsuburaya.
We've got to get out of here.
Here's one of the best shots of the battle, with all the miniature structures in the foreground and the fiery skyline optically added in the background. There's so much to enjoy in this brief shot. The monster movement is quick, but you don't feel it's unnatural because the monsters are aggressively attacking each other.
Here we also see some more composition shots of crowds fleeing in the foreground while the monsters are fighting. It's an effect used repeatedly throughout this entire battle sequence. The production schedule for this movie was even shorter than the first Godzilla film. This movie was greenlighted in November of 1954 and came out 6 months later in April of 55. The special effects staff did an incredible amount of work here, much of it very, very good. And they must have benefited from the fact that they'd done this before, and also from the fact that Tsuburaya was gaining stature at Toho and the crew had more space and resources to work with.
Well, it was still a largely inexperienced crew at this time. A lot of the people that joined the studio for Godzilla, they still hadn't even had 6 months of experience under their belts, and they were still hiring a lot of newcomers without any special skills. So the unexpected still did happen, as we're going to see in a few moments.
Awful thing happened to her people? What had they done to earn such a dreadful punishment?
Masaru Sato's original music can be heard once again, and these first few shots of the monsters squaring off and destroying the industrial complex are staged beautifully.
In some of these monster close-ups where hand puppets were used, Godzilla really has bad dental work.
But suddenly the monster action speeds up significantly and it looks quite bizarre. According to special effects cameraman Sadamasa Arakawa, many of the assistant special effects cameramen were basically rookies. So while he tried to check their work as much as possible, he also had to depend on them to do their jobs properly. This scene was shot with 3 cameras, all of which were supposed to be using high-speed photography. But one of the assistant cameramen mistakenly set the camera speed slower rather than faster, resulting in this kind of hyperkinetic action, and this mistake was repeated in another shot coming up in a few moments.
I personally really think this lightning-fast speed works quite well with the hand-to-hand monster fighting, though it is hard to believe that creatures that big would be able to move so fast. Cameraman Arikawa also said that when special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya checked the dailies for these scenes, 2 out of 3 cameras were set to the correct speed, but when they checked the film from that third camera you were talking about, Tsuburaya was quite surprised to see this herky-jerky movement. But he ultimately decided that it wasn't so bad after all and that they should use it.
We should note then how much easier it was for Haruo Nakajima to move around in this Godzilla suit. In the first film, the suit was really stiff, but this one was made from much lighter materials. Sculptor Teizo Toshimitsu patterned the suit after the original, but he made it significantly more slender, particularly in the lower body and legs. And this had the effect of making Godzilla look a bit less powerful and imposing. But this was a concession for the comfort of the suit actor, and it also seemed out of necessity considering all the aggressive action which the screenplay called for. You can see that the suit was made much thinner and had a cloth skin covered with latex. Sometimes it folds and bunches up like baggy clothing. The head is much different than the original, and it has very prominent teeth. In profile, the head looks sort of menacing, but from straight on, Godzilla has big ears and eyebrows that make him look a little bit friendly.
This sequence here, where the monsters knock down a building and it starts a chain reaction ending with the 3 escaped prisoners drowning in the flooded subway, is really exciting, and there are so many elements to it. Live action location shots, a miniature set of the subway station, and optical effects. These are really the only people to die on camera during the monster attack, and since they're not really characters in the story, they're totally expendable.
I believe that the escaped convicts are hiding out now in the Yoroyabashi subway station of the Mitosuji line. It's one of the main downtown stations that's close to Osaka City Hall. There's a huge amount of water that crashes through the ceiling of the set, and coming up is a very bold shot. They matte water flowing into the scene, but it really works thanks to some excellent work by the optical department. The fact that the film is black and white helps make this shot succeed. In color, there's a lot of blue bleed, and the transparency of the matte elements would make this effect much more obvious.
Anguirus is a really inspired creation. It has big spikes on its crown and a long horned snout with dagger-like teeth lining its jaws. Suit actor Tezuka had to walk on his knees with the bottoms of the monster's feet exposed, so the special effects crew photographed Anguirus from angles that hide the hind legs behind buildings or trees or other obstacles. This is really the most effective four-legged monster that Toho ever created in the early years.
Now this is one of the nicest scene compositions, and it's easy to overlook the fact that the gate and the castle wall are optically added to this shot. These are probably my favorite shots of the battle as the monsters are squaring off. Their movements are rather slow, and the framing is really nice, and you get to see the monsters in all their glory. The battling remains very animalistic, and there's not a single humanoid tactic that's used. And now you know what's coming up next. That miniature castle isn't just there for show. You can't have monsters battling next to a landmark like this just for fun. It just has to come down.
Now here as the monsters approach the landmark Osaka Castle, the police officers will take their positions, guns at the ready, as if they could possibly be of any use. Osaka Castle, for you history buffs, was built in 1583 and was occupied by various government and military rulers through the centuries, and it was damaged several times in various conflicts. In 1931, much of the structure was rebuilt using ferro concrete, but now Godzilla and Anguillus will do some of their damage to it.
The massive miniature Osaka Castle was built on only 3 sides. Leaving the backside open not only saved time in building it, but it also allowed the staff to pre-cut the building's internal structures, and a large number of wires were attached to various parts for stagehands to yank on and pull the structure apart so they could make it collapse when the monsters crashed into it. This was necessary since the building was made of plaster, which is generally quite hard and would tend to break off in large chunks. For all the money shots in the film, like this one, they used high-speed photography to slow down the action and create a more realistic image.
And here we'll see one of the few instances of graphic violence in the early Godzilla movies.
The battle is really rather brutal with all the biting, and yes, there's some bloodshed, but it's not really too graphic, as Godzilla finally wins. It's kind of nice after all the incorrect monster roars that were used earlier in the film that finally you get to hear Godzilla's own voice as he belts out a victory cry. Godzilla actor Nakajima took a lot of satisfaction in beating Anguillus here. He proudly recalled how he made his fellow suit actor, Katsumi Tezuka, swallow a lot of water in the process. And at last, Godzilla uses his atomic breath in victory, though it does kind of make you wonder why he didn't use it during the battle more than once.
In the Japanese version, Dr. Yamane theorizes that these 2 monsters were revived by H-bomb tests in the Pacific, so the anti-nuclear statement is there somewhat. We see some long shots here of the city of Osaka on fire, similar to scenes of Tokyo ablaze in Godzilla, but the destruction at this time is caused by the monsters fighting and knocking over buildings in the process. It's not like the first film where Godzilla was a walking death metaphor. And why are these monsters fighting anyway? That might have made an interesting plot point.
They're fighting because it sells more tickets.
So that leaves us with one last and terrible menace.
Some writers have observed that if the original Godzilla is a metaphor for Hiroshima, then Godzilla Raids Again is the Nagasaki of the Godzilla series, an event just as devastating as the first, but not as prominent in the history books because it wasn't the first. This image, as Hidemi looks down on the flaming city of Osaka with the smoke rising like a mushroom cloud, certainly lends weight to that interpretation. This is truly chilling, and there's no doubt what this image is meant to represent. If only the rest of the movie were so powerful. Here's a tracking shot of the ruins of Osaka on the day after at Ground Zero, a very similar shot to the one used for the same purpose in the first Godzilla. And here, Key Luke says in his narration, "It was a sight to crush the hearts of men." It's a very nice echo of Raymond Burr's narration in Godzilla King of the Monsters when he calls Tokyo a smoldering memorial to the unknown. Here the characters are mopping up the burned-out offices of their fishing company, and the English dialogue is awkwardly written in yet more attempts to match the words to the lip movements at the expense of logic. I love how they decide to rebuild the business, and the company president says, "Right away, I'll go get the tools." They're going to need more than a hammer and a pair of pliers for this job. And in this time of mourning and sorrow, our friend the music editor is literally playing the violin, thanks to more stock music, of course.
Good day, sir. Good day.
And here, Hidemi asks Mr. Shibaki, "Did you see what happened?" "Why, no, I didn't. What happened exactly?" We mentioned earlier that George Takei is one of the actors performing the English dialogue, and you can hear Mr. Sulu's voice throughout this movie in a number of smaller roles. And in fact, many of the voice actors seem to be playing multiple parts. The voice of the fishing company president here and several other characters are done by actor and voice impresario Paul Frees, who was the voice of Boris Badenov in the Bullwinkle cartoons. And the narration at the beginning of the movie is done by character actor Marvin Miller, and we believe Miller may also be doing the voice of Kobayashi in a sort of mock Asian accent that sounds a bit like Barney Rubble or Yogi Bear at times. In fact, the voices of the male characters all tend to have this quite cartoony sound, while the female characters actually sound quite natural. Stuart Galbraith's theory is that the actresses doing the female voices may actually be Japanese American because they pronounce the Japanese names like Skyoka correctly and effortlessly. For people caught up in a disaster of epic proportions, these characters are rather happy-go-lucky. It's nice that they can share a hearty laugh in times like this. Perhaps this was meant as a counterpoint to the scenes of the burning city, or to symbolize the spirit and resolve of the people who rebuilt Japan after the war. Or maybe it was just a poor choice by the filmmakers because it really trivializes all the destruction. With the city of Osaka in ruins, the fishing company transfers its operations to Japan's northernmost island, Hokkaido, and the story suddenly shifts locations rather arbitrarily. This is a rather odd choice on the part of the screenwriters. After all, wouldn't it be more heroic for the heroes to stay in Osaka and rebuild and essentially fight back? But instead they run away, more or less. But alas, their troubles will follow them here. Incidentally, Hokkaido was annexed by Japan in the 1800s, and it's different from the rest of the country in terms of climate and somewhat in culture. Moving the story from Osaka to Hokkaido is almost like going from San Francisco to Alaska. And as our movie takes a detour to Hokkaido, I'd like to take a detour and talk about the long, strange trip that Godzilla Raids Again made before being released in the United States. The original Godzilla was released in Japan in November of 1954, and the new U.S. version with Raymond Burr appeared about 18 months later. But it took a full 4 years after Godzilla Raids Again was released in Japan before it appeared in the United States. And when it did appear, it was given the bizarre new title, Gigantis the Fire Monster. So what happened during that 4-year delay, and why was the title changed? Well, the people who bought the U.S. rights to Godzilla Raids Again around 1956 or 57 were members of the same group of small-time film tycoons who had brought Godzilla to America. Because the Raymond Burr version of Godzilla was so successful, these producers decided to go one step further this time. And instead of simply incorporating an American actor into the Japanese footage, they'd do the opposite. They'd incorporate some of the Japanese footage, specifically the special effects scenes, into a new American science fiction movie, which was to be titled The Volcano Monsters. It sounds rather unbelievable now, but what happened next is extensively documented. 2 writers were hired, the Danish writer Ib Melchior, who would eventually become famous as the director of Angry Red Planet, but who was just starting out at this time, and Edwin Watson. And together they devised a new story about a volcanic eruption in Japan that opens a cave where 2 giant monsters, a Tyrannosaurus and an Ankylosaurus, are found perfectly preserved. Scientists ship the 2 monsters to the U.S. for study, but en route they awaken from hibernation and they do battle in San Francisco. The 2 writers spent hours in front of an old moviola cataloging all the special effects shots that they would use in this movie. Their 129-page shooting script, which is dated May 7 of 1957, contains specific instructions to the film editor about which shots of Godzilla or Anguirus or the military fighter jets, the crowds fleeing, which of that was to be used and where it was to be inserted into the film. The monsters were not called by their names in the script. They were simply dinosaurs in this version, so all scenes of Godzilla spewing its atomic breath were to be cut out, and there were notes in the script telling the editor to cut away before Godzilla's dorsal fins would light up. And here we have yet another narrator whom we haven't heard before. If this is a letter from Kobayashi, why don't we hear Kobayashi's voice? Incidentally, they spelled Kobayashi's name incorrectly. Ib Melchior talks extensively about the Volcano Monsters in his biography, Man of Imagination. And I interviewed Melchior in 1993, and at that time he said of his work on the Volcano Monsters, quote, "We watched the movie, and we took notes of all the effects stuff, and then we sat down and thought about how we could build our story around it, an American story. It wasn't easy. The idea was that we didn't want anyone to know this was a Japanese film, so we eliminated the entire Japanese story and cast. This was my first feature film, so I worked very, very hard on it. But of course the movie was not made, and it's very hard to say how it would have turned out. The Japanese film that we were given to begin with wasn't very good, but we tried very hard to turn it into something different." The screenplay for the Volcano Monsters also required that a number of new special effects scenes be filmed, including some involving the 2 monsters. How could the American producers possibly add new footage of the monsters? Well, as it turned out, Toho actually shipped 2 costumes, one Godzilla and one Anguirus, to Hollywood sometime in or around 1957. This is also well documented. In the 1990s, a photograph of these 2 costumes, along with the special effects men who created them, Teizo Toshimitsu, Kanzi Yagi, and Eizo Kaimai, was published in several Japanese-language books. The new monster scenes were going to be filmed at Howard A. Anderson's special effects studio, which did a lot of optical effects and other work for companies like AIP in the 50s. One day in 1957, Special effects artist Bob Burns, who is now famous for playing Kogar the gorilla in many films and who is also an author and one of the world's biggest sci-fi movie prop collectors. He was working at the Anderson studio doing special effects for a film called Invasion of the Saucermen when he made an amazing discovery. Here's Bob Burns to tell us what happened.
I was working with Paul Blaisdell, the guy that created She-Creature and Conquered the World, Invasion of the Saucermen. Really great guy, did some great stuff. And I was sort of his assistant and worked with him on things. And we were shooting at Howard Anderson's insert stage for the Invasion of the Saucermen. Well, there's one place in there where we have to blow up the saucer. Well, we had a wooden saucer Paul had made, and he made a cardboard one that would blow up pretty easily. And they loaded it with squibs and black powder and all that stuff. We knew it was going to be a pretty big explosion. So we wanted to find somewhere to hide. So we actually hid behind a couple of big crates. And then I happened to look on the crate, and I see some Japanese writing on it. And then I see somebody had written in a pen in English, Godzilla. And I thought, whoa, wow, because I was a big fan of Godzilla. So I thought, what's this, you know? So I asked Howard Jr., I said, what's in these cases? So anyway, one was Godzilla and one was Anguillus underneath it in another case. And I thought, wow. And he said, yeah, we're going to do some footage, some new footage. And so they had the suits there. And of course, Paul and I, both being Godzilla fans, you know, and just fans period, said, could we take a peek maybe? And the lid was open, and they said, yeah, sure. We opened it up, and sure enough, there was the Godzilla suit in there. You know, it was kind of a gray color and all that stuff, kind of a dark greenish gray. We took it out, and I was surprised how short it was, but it looked great. Then we started really examining it, and we saw all these burnt holes in it. I mean, there were holes burned all through it, and I'd heard he had got burnt and hurt doing the films, and this is where they would tie the wire and then shoot the little missiles, and they'd blow up, and he got actually burnt because some of the holes were clear through. It was canvas, like built canvas with rubber on top of it, and there was holes clear through it, so he got burnt pretty bad. So then we set him aside, and we saw Anguillus. We didn't take him out because he's really big with the big spikes. That would have taken a lot of people to haul him out of there, but at least we looked at him and saw him, and he was like kind of reddish and grayish and had the big spikes. He looked really cool.
I asked Bob if he knows what happened to the Godzilla suit and Anguillus suit that he happened to find that day.
Now, I guess that film never took place, and they probably sent the suits back. I've heard since that maybe the Godzilla suit was stolen. Really have no idea. But when I saw Godzilla in there, we had to take a peek. And it was, what a thing. I mean, what a great memory it is, you know. I actually saw the Godzilla suit, you know, it was pretty cool.
These pilots were having quite a party, weren't they? They had so much to drink they couldn't even get the words to "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow" right. So now what are they going to do? Jump into their planes and go fight Godzilla. Children, please don't try this at home. Back in the early 1940s, many of the special effects people at Toho were working on propaganda war movies, so it's kind of ironic that their work appears alongside this stock footage, which appears to be from an American war newsreel or an educational film showing the Japanese threat in the Pacific Rim. And now, ladies and gentlemen, more stock footage.
Gigantis could strike anywhere.
And this time it's designed to illustrate that this is an international crisis and that the whole world is watching, and that the United States Congress is doing all it can to help, namely sitting around and looking bored. Glad to know our legislators were just as effective then as now. There's an overhead shot here that looks like Depression-era footage of people lining up for their government handouts. Apparently, everyone is preparing for the upcoming disaster by stocking up on cheese. Well, let's get back to our story about the Volcano Monsters. If you're a fan of these films, it may seem like blasphemy, but the idea of cannibalizing a movie in this way, of using only the special effects scenes, was not totally unprecedented. Obviously, Godzilla King of the Monsters had done it to an extent, but another Toho film, Monster Snowman, was hacked up and released in the United States as half-human in 1955, and Toho had also shipped a monster costume to Hollywood for that film, so that the producers could film a scene of the dead monster, which was a Bigfoot-like creature, on a morgue slab. And in subsequent years, Roger Corman did similar things with Russian sci-fi pictures, like Battle Beyond the Sun. The fact that monster suits were sent to Hollywood indicates just how close the Volcano Monsters came to being made. In fact, this project was such a done deal that in 1957, Toho listed the Volcano Monsters in a brochure announcing all of its upcoming titles for international release. And also, this project was announced in May 1957 in Variety, with a production start scheduled for June. But the movie, obviously, was never made. ABPT Pictures Corporation, the company that was behind the production, suddenly went out of business in the summer of 1957, leaving several projects in development, including this one. Incidentally, screenwriter Ib Melchior would a few years later recycle some of his ideas from the Volcano Monsters in the Danish sci-fi movie Reptilicus. Here, Kobayashi is asking Hidemi what kind of present she would like as a cover for the fact that he needs advice on what to buy for his own girlfriend. Hidemi, being the rich company president's daughter, lists an assortment of high-priced items, to which Kobayashi scoffs. Incidentally, Hidemi says handbags in both the Japanese and English version.
Alright, you don't have to tell me.
I find this scene particularly annoying because just as some tension and action were starting to build up, it all grinds to a halt so we can get back to the soap opera. In all the best Toho Golden Age sci-fi films of the 50s and 60s, the human drama and the monster story are interweaved in an interesting way, and the characters' actions propel the story forward in an interesting way. But here, you have a rather dull soap opera, and the intersection between the characters' lives and the monster action is purely coincidental. They stumble upon the monsters on the island, they stumble upon the police during the car chase, they just happen to be in Hokkaido when Godzilla appears again. And of course, this scene where Kobayashi reveals an inkling of his personal life is meant to set up his sacrifice so that it'll tug on our emotions when it happens. But in terms of character development, this is too little too late. These characters are just drifting along. They don't drive the action forward or take an active role in the drama until the final third of the movie when Tsuki and Kobayashi lend the Air Force a hand. That's why the movie feels a bit lethargic when the monsters aren't on screen. But fortunately, as we'll see here, as if on cue, the monsters show up again whenever things start to get a little bit too slow.
C-103. Tsukioka calling. I just saw him.
Okay. Don't land. Come straight here.
Suki, state your position.
Wait, I'll see.
And in this none too subtle shot, Kobayashi leaves his little black book on the desk.
53 north, near Kamito Island. He's just landed there.
I'm going right out. Keep a steady course.
Kobayashi,
Huh?
one last thing. You'll think of her?
I will.
Yes, I knew you would.
And you be good.
And my secret love's no secret anymore, thanks to nosy girls who look through my papers while I'm not around. Kobayashi really is the only one of the main characters with a personality, and look how he's posed with a cigarette in the photo, very cosmopolitan. He's affable and outgoing, yet his romantic heart harbors a secret.
Yes. Would you notify headquarters, please? Yes. Hello? Headquarters. The Navy is on its way. Yes.
Why would a reptile, presumably a cold-blooded animal, head north where it's freezing cold? Incidentally, in the Volcano Monsters script, the battle sequences on the island were rewritten to take place in the Arctic, and the monster, which was simply called a Tyrannosaurus, was heading there to lay its eggs. And of course, it was to be reshot and edited so that American pilots were flying the planes.
I started to hunt down the Gigantis monster.
So with the Volcano Monsters project crashed and burned, what happened? Well, in 1958, the U.S. rights to Godzilla Raids Again ended up in the hands of Hollywood attorney Paul Schreibman and a few other investors. And they financed a very modest Americanization of the movie, consisting, as we pointed out, of dubbing, stock footage, and music replacement, plus a few inserts of newspaper headlines and whatnot. Schreibman also owned the rights to a low-budget film called Teenagers from Outer Space, and he made a deal with Pacific Theaters and Warner Brothers to distribute the two movies together across the United States on a double bill starting in May of 1959. The promotional campaign for Gigantis was typical 1950s exploitation, and here's an example of that. Two ultra-rare radio commercials from 1959.
Hey kids, the fantastic fire monsters are coming. Mighty Gigantis crushing whole cities in its wrath. Deadly Anguirus screaming its challenge of battle to the death. They're out to destroy each other, but first they'll destroy the world. Look out for Gigantis the fire monster. See the war of the fantastic fire monsters that rains destruction on the world. See Gigantis, the fire monster from Warner Brothers. Also, teenagers from outer space. Young hoodlums from another planet on a fantastic ray gun rampage across the motion picture screen.
And again, we have more imagery evoking memories of the war and perhaps of the women left behind. This is a lovely shot of Setsuko Wakayama. And I don't know if it was intentional, but this is an oft-repeated visual motif in the movie with people looking through the windows of buildings and airplanes. In these scenes where Tsuki and Kobayashi fly over the island, we can see Godzilla surrounded by the icy peaks. It's an impressive view, but it would have been even more impressive if Godzilla were actually moving instead of standing completely motionless. And indeed, that was the original intent. That's actually a Godzilla prop that was equipped with a wind-up motor that enabled it to walk. But apparently either the prop didn't work or Tsuburaya wasn't satisfied with the way it moved, so the model was filmed in the stationary position instead.
Gigantis returning to the beach.
Well, we should finish the story of how Godzilla Raids Again became the Volcano Monsters and then ultimately Gigantis. And that leaves the question, why call the monster Gigantis? Well, as we said, producer Paul Schreibman proudly said it was his idea to change the monster's name because he didn't want people to be confused. Which is ironic because that's exactly what happened. People went to the movies and saw this and they wondered why no one was calling the monster Godzilla. Even though the first Godzilla movie was a big hit in the United States, the monster was not a franchise-type character yet, and the producers probably felt it would be a safer bet to introduce an all-new monster instead of a sequel. But Gigantis the Fire Monster was a flop, both at the box office and with the critics. The reviewers were none too kind, especially when it came to the dubbing, and they often pointed to the infamous banana oil line as evidence of the movie's ineptness. The tension really starts to mount now as we can sense an exciting battle about to take place. Now Tsukioka is riding shotgun with Tajima, his old buddy, while Kobayashi remains rather vulnerable in the little scouting plane as he continues to buzz Godzilla. Kobayashi's rather brave as he keeps Godzilla distracted until the Air Force arrives, but it's not clear why Kobayashi hangs around even after the fighter jets begin their attack. Apparently he missed the scene back in Osaka where Godzilla picked off a fighter plane in midair with his atomic breath. Self-sacrifice and atonement is a common theme in Japanese folklore and stories and movies, even science fiction movies. Of course, in the first Godzilla, Dr. Serizawa sacrifices himself to rid the world of Godzilla and to prevent his horrible invention from ever being used by warmongers. But Kobayashi's self-sacrifice here is not premeditated, and he certainly doesn't have anything to atone for. One could make a rather obvious comparison to the kamikaze pilots of World War II, whose actions on behalf of the nation were viewed as honorable and brave. But Kobayashi's death is the result of pure foolhardiness. It's an accident more than a suicide run. And so while it is a shock that one of our main characters gets killed off in this way, his death doesn't really resonate emotionally because it wasn't foreshadowed in a dramatic way. It's sad that Kobayashi is dead, but it doesn't really mean anything more than that. And it's also a bit odd that Kobayashi commits the bravest act in the movie and essentially becomes the hero rather than Tsukioka, the main character, who looks on rather helplessly. Yoshio Tsuchiya, who plays Tajima here, was a member of Akira Kurosawa's stock company of actors, as were Minoru Chiaki and Takashi Shimura, two other cast members. What were such high-profile Japanese actors of the day doing in a monster movie like this one? I asked Stuart Galbraith to give us a little bit of insight into that.
Well, the big special effects pictures that Toho made didn't have the B-movie stigma that science fiction did in America. Also, you have to consider two things. One, that the studio system was still very strong in Japan, and secondly, actors back then also made lots and lots of movies. So if an actor did 10 movies in 1 year, and one of those was science fiction done on an A-picture scale, it wasn't a big deal. That's why in classic Japanese sci-fi and fantasy films, you'll occasionally see Ozu actors like Setsuko Hara and Shishu Ryu, Kurosawa actors like Takashi Shimura and Kyoko Kagawa, and all the rest of them.
And Yoshio Tsuchiya, in particular, he rather enjoyed appearing in monster movies. He once said, quote, "As far as I was concerned, it was equally prestigious to appear in science fiction films or in Kurosawa movies. Back then, there were many people who looked at special effects movies as weird things, but I once said those kinds of people weren't really intelligent because movie fans were just dying to see our films." Tsuchiya, of course, is quite the eccentric. He claims to have seen UFOs on multiple occasions, and he really enjoys playing space aliens.
Come on! Good work. Throw some rocket bombs at him.
Well, here's an example of what we were talking about when we said the pacing of the final battle is choppy. The Air Corps return to the war room and plot out their attack on Godzilla on a chalkboard while they're reloading their bombs and refueling their planes. While this may or may not be realistic, to abandon the attack on Godzilla just when it was reaching a climax and just as Kobayashi had died and there was this hint of emotion in the air, the tension is now completely deflated. The diagram on the board and the strategy session don't tell us anything we don't already know. The sole purpose of this scene is so Tsukioka can ask his buddy to let him fly one of the fighter jets, which begs the question, why didn't he ask the first time? Cutting the big battle into two halves really brings the movie to a halt for a few minutes here.
Yes, sir. Squad ready.
Captain, you always said you would...
Well, we're getting ready for the final big special effects sequence in this film, and so Ed Godzucheski is back with me.
Thank you, Steve, for having me back again.
And that is Haruo Nakajima in the Godzilla suit, buried under what looks like tons of ice. And he always put up with some quite grueling conditions in his suit work, but this looks like a very thankless job.
Now, here as the Army is disembarking from the transports, you wouldn't even notice it, but the sky and the tops of the rocks and the edge of the ship on the left, they're all matte paintings.
So those snowy peaks in the upper part of the frame, that's actually a painting.
Everything is a painting there except the live-action portion.
Amazing. Now, Godzilla's been trapped under the ice for quite some time now. Remember, the Air Corps had to go back and refuel their planes, and they haven't arrived yet. So Godzilla's actually had quite a bit of time here to escape, and it makes me wonder why he didn't use his atomic breath to melt the ice and free himself.
Yeah, well, I guess, the way I look at it is that Godzilla being a reptile, or a kind of dinosaur, that the cold has kind of robbed him of his powers to some extent. It's certainly making him weak, and the fact that the way this film ends, it's not that difficult to believe.
And that shot of Godzilla's eyes, that close-up, was quite well animated and quite striking.
Yeah, that's one of the few times that the movement of the eyes can actually be seen on film. All these guys, it looks like on the set there they actually had snow rather than, typically in a film like this you're going to see that they make artificial snow, but I think that was all real snow that they were walking through. Now, it's funny that Tsukioka, he's been talking his head off throughout the whole film, and now, when it actually might make some sense to explain just what these military guys are up to, we don't even hear a word from him.
And that's another matte painting.
Yeah, as the transports are leaving, the sky and the rocks on the side and the ice in the foreground, all of that was a matte painting.
And throughout this sequence, the orders are barked out by the general in George Takei's voice again.
Now here, the fact that the fire seems to bother Godzilla enough that he's going to turn around and head back inland sort of flies in the face of him being a fire monster, as at least they've contended in this Americanized version. It seems kind of odd that Godzilla's even in the least bit fazed by fire, since he regularly sets fire to things on his own. But I guess as a dramatic device, I think it's acceptable. And, at the worst, maybe Godzilla's just kind of annoyed at the fire and especially the smoke that's generated from this.
The fire monster is afraid of fire. I think it's kind of amazing that these 50-gallon drums explode and the flames are 150 feet high. Now, in this sequence, you can really admire the effects work on the miniature planes in these flying sequences. You can see quite a bit of improvement over the same type of work that was done in the first Godzilla film. The actual flight of the planes themselves is quite much more animated, and you see it, much more movement. And of course, you actually get to see the pilots flying the planes. So it's not just these models flying by. You actually know that there's somebody in the planes, and it makes it that much more realistic.
I think that really makes a big difference.
And these are wonderful tracking shots. The overhead tracking shot of Godzilla in the canyon. We see about 3 variations of that in this sequence.
Yes. Now, all the shots, the missiles exploding against the mountainside and these up angles of Godzilla that show him roaring as the explosions go off, all these were done outside because they really needed the natural sky behind all this movement. If you did it indoors, all you would see is the top of the set. And the editing, as it's done here, really makes this attack seem relentless. You don't even notice easily that some of the same footage is being reused by flipping the frame. Several of the shots when Godzilla kind of flips his head around and looks as explosions go off just above him, they're being reused and flipped backwards so that they can get a little more mileage out of it. And this is actually done a little more extensively in the American version rather than in the Japanese version. So you kind of get a bit of a longer battle here.
You can really tell how cold it was on this set. If you look carefully, you can see frost accumulating on the outside of the Godzilla suit, especially in the area on the neck where there are holes for Nakajima to see out of.
Now, the avalanche of ice and snow that you're seeing is actually exactly what it looks like. It's an avalanche of real ice. And it's being dropped from an ice maker that was rented from an ice rink. And so it created the real ice. And actually the filmmakers were a little concerned that the ice chunks were a little too big to look realistic. But, when you see the way it looks here, it's being filmed here, it looks terrific.
A couple of miniature planes explode here. One collides with the mountainside, and just a moment ago there was one that exploded in midair after Godzilla fired his ray on it.
Yeah, what's interesting about that is that it was extremely hard to try and time those kind of explosions to happen, especially having the jet, the very split second that it hits the mountainside that it explodes. And that's an amazing feat of timing on the part of the pyrotechnics crew.
I always wondered, knowing that Eiji Tsuburaya had such a love of King Kong, if this sequence is, in a way, his tribute to the final battle between King Kong and the planes on the Empire State Building.
And I don't know who the technician was that was controlling the hand puppet here, but I think he really earned his money by controlling the puppet from underneath all that, tons and tons of snow and ice there.
And another wonderful tracking shot through the canyon.
Just really exciting looking photography. When you think back to all the films in this series, this is probably the one time that mankind has defeated Godzilla without the use of any kind of special technology or super weapons or even with the assistance of other monsters. It's really quite a clever idea, which doesn't leave you feeling cheated, like it was too easy or it was just a contrivance. It's a definitive defeat for Godzilla.
Of course, it wasn't truly definitive because Godzilla's not dead. He's just been put on ice for a while. Godzilla Raids Again did fairly well at the Japanese box office in 1955, but it failed to make much of an impact on the public imagination, and so Godzilla's film career was put on hold while Toho's science fiction genre grew and flourished. Godzilla finally broke out of his icy tomb in 1962's King Kong vs. Godzilla, the movie that would truly make the monster a movie star and an international franchise character.
Kobayashi, to you with our gratitude.
Here, as the movie ends, the American version continues to tinker, attempting to take the original ending, which is quite melancholy, and turn it into a happy ending instead. So, instead of ending with Tsukioka shedding tears for his fallen friend, Kobayashi, as it should be, we get the bells of happiness and stereotypical images of Japanese people praying, and the supposedly happy couple looking rather ill at ease with each other, courtesy of what else? More stock footage taken from the banana oil scene earlier in the movie on the rooftop. And finally, we get a lovely sunset as Suki tells us that he and Hidemi were happy forevermore. For a long time, Godzilla Raids Again, or Gigantis, was essentially a Lost Godzilla movie in the United States. Well, now that it's finally on DVD, you can compare and contrast the Japanese version, which is quiet and understated, flawed yet entertaining, and this American version, which is in a class by itself, a classic example of 1950s psychotronic sci-fi entertainment. Thanks for tuning in.